My parents stole the $150,000 I had saved for my daughter's surgery. My dad laughed. Thanks for funding your brother's wedding. And didn't even invite me. I smiled and said nothing. Moments later, police special forces stormed the wedding, arresting his wife. My mom called me, crying. I stood in the hospital hallway, watching a nurse replace a thin plastic tube. The fluorescent light flickered above my head. Every second felt like a drop of heavy lead. My daughter was pale and too quiet. The bank app on my phone showed a perfect, hollow zero. I refreshed the screen until my thumb went numb. 5 years of double shifts and skipped meals had evaporated in a single afternoon. My mother had the joint access for emergencies, but her definition of a crisis involved floral arrangements. I leaned against the cold brick of the hospital exterior. My father's ladder still echoed in my ears like a serrated blade. He actually believed he had won. He didn't know I was counting. I walked toward the country club where the reception began. I didn't enter the ballroom. I stayed in the shadows of the stone pillars. I watched the catering staff carry trays of champagne that cost more than Emma's medicine. My brother Julian stood by the fountain, adjusting a silk tie that didn't belong to him. He looked like a man who had never felt a day of consequence. His bride, Sophia, glowed under the crystal chandeliers. They were dancing on my daughter's grave. Earlier that morning, I had sat with a federal investigator in a dim coffee shop. I gave him the encrypted drive containing Julian's secret ledgers. I explained how the wedding venue was being used to wash a decade of dirty money. The agent didn't smile. He just nodded and checked his tactical watch. I told him exactly when the cake would be cut. That was the moment the assets would be most concentrated. My family thought I was a pushover. I was actually the architect. The sun began to dip behind the manicured trees. I saw the first black SUV roll silently onto the gravel path. Then came 4 more, moving with predatory grace. Men in tactical gear spilled out like ink across the white pavement. They didn't use sirens. They used boots and iron resolve. The music inside the ballroom was a soft jazz melody. It died mid-note when the front doors splintered. I checked my phone. The surgery deposit deadline was only 20 minutes away. The screaming started almost immediately. I heard the sound of glass shattering and chairs scraping against the polished wood. Guests poured out of the side exits, their faces masks of confusion and terror. Through the large windows, I saw Julian pinned against a buffet table. Sophia was in handcuffs, her lace veil snagged on a silver tray. My father stood frozen in the center of the chaos. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. The laughter was finally gone. My phone vibrated against my palm. I answered without saying a word. My mother's voice was a ragged, high-pitched wail. She begged me to call my contacts and stop the nightmare. She kept saying they were an innocent family. I looked at the hospital tower in the distance. I told her that theft has many names, but justice only has one. I explained that her son's bride was the primary target. The line went dead when she started to scream my name again. I walked back to my car as the red and blue lights painted the trees. The $150,000 was already being flagged for restitution to the rightful owner. My daughter's surgeon sent a text confirming the mourning slot. The lie of family loyalty was buried under the weight of the truth. Emma would get her new heart, 'cause I stopped trying to be the good son. I gripped the steering wheel and finally breathed. For the first time in years, my own heart beat steady. I parked in the hospital garage and watched the police cruisers fade in my rearview mirror. My hands were finally steady as I gripped the steering wheel. The air in the car smelled like stale coffee and copper. I needed to confirm Emma's status before the bank frozen assets became a legal nightmare. The hospital lobby was quiet, filled with the hum of vending machines and distant pagers. I moved toward the elevators, avoiding my reflection in the polished brass doors. I looked like a ghost. The intensive care unit felt colder than the streets. I found Emma's surgeon, Dr. Aris, standing near a monitor that displayed Emma's irregular heartbeat. He didn't look up when I approached. The green lines on the screen jumped in frantic, jagged peaks. He told me the 48-hour window was closing fast. We needed the specialized valve delivered by dawn. I assured him the funds were returning. He looked at me with pity, unaware of the war I had just ended. He saw a father failing. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. It was an unknown number, likely the precinct or a lawyer. I stepped into the stairwell to answer. It wasn't my mother this time. It was Julian's best man, a guy named Marcus who handled the logistics for the family business. He sounded breathless, frantic, and desperate. He told me there was a secondary account they hadn't found yet. He offered me half if I could get the feds to back off. He thought I was still for sale. I listened to the static on the line. Marcus explained that Julian had hidden cash in a safe deposit box under my daughter's name. My stomach turned at the sheer audacity of their cover. They hadn't just stolen her money. They had used her identity to anchor their fraud. If the police found that box, Emma would be tied to a federal crime before her 8th birthday. The leverage shifted in my chest. I wasn't just saving her life now. I was protecting her entire future. I told Marcus I would meet him at the private vault downtown. It was a lie, but it bought me time to think. I called my contact at the Federal Bureau while walking back to Emma's room. I needed to move faster than the investigators. If I didn't reach that box first, the restitution process would stall for years. The legal system moves like a glacier, but Emma's heart was a desert. I watched her small chest rise and fall. She looked so incredibly fragile. The drive to the downtown vault took 10 minutes through empty streets. The city was a blur of neon and gray. I reached the secure facility just as the late shift manager was locking the gate. I showed him my identification and the power of attorney documents. He hesitated, noting the late hour in my disheveled suit. I didn't blink. I used the same cold stare I gave the insurance adjusters. He eventually sighed and swiped his keycard. The heavy steel door groaned as it opened. The air inside the vault was dry and smelled of old paper. I found the box numbered 402, registered in Emma's name. My key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. Inside, there were stacks of $100 bills wrapped in plastic. But beneath the money sat a single manila envelope. I opened it and found the original surgery deposit receipt from 3 years ago. My parents hadn't just stolen the money recently. They had been skimming from her life for years. I felt sick. I took the envelope and left the cash. The police would find the money. But the paper in my hand was the only thing that mattered. It was the proof of premeditated intent. I walked back into the night air, feeling the weight of the envelope against my ribs. My father had been lying to me since Emma was a toddler. He hadn't just laughed at the wedding. He had been laughing at every birthday and every Christmas. My phone lit up with a final message. It was a text from the surgeon. The valve had arrived early due to a cancellation in another city. They were prepping Emma for the theater in 30 minutes. I didn't have time to celebrate the recovery of the funds. I had to get back before she went under. As I started the engine, a dark sedan pulled up behind me. Blocking the exit, Marcus stepped out, holding a heavy tire iron. He wasn't there to talk anymore. He wanted the box key back. Marcus didn't move like a businessman anymore. He gripped the iron bar with white knuckles. The parking lot was a concrete cage. I kept the engine running, the vibrations traveling up my spine. My objective was back at the hospital, but the path was blocked by a man with nothing left to lose. I rolled the window down just an inch. The cold air bit at my skin. He demanded the envelope. I held it up, watching his eyes dart toward the evidence. He looked desperate. I shifted the car into reverse. Marcus lunged forward, swinging the iron bar against my hood. The sound of metal meeting metal was deafening. I didn't flinch. I needed him to think I was cornered. He screamed about the money and the feds. I realized then that Marcus wasn't just Julian's friend. He was the one who had actually moved the funds into Emma's name. He was the architect of the paper trail. He was terrified of being the fall guy for my family. The realization gave me a sudden edge. I stopped the car and stepped out. I didn't reach for a weapon. I held out my phone, the screen glowing with a pre-dialed number. I told him the feds were already watching the vault. It was a bluff, but his hesitation was visible. He lowered the iron bar just an inch. The shadows on his face shifted. He asked if I had told them about the secondary ledger. I saw the opening. He was ready to flip. We stood in the silence of the garage. I offered him a deal. I wouldn't mention his name in the initial statement if he moved his car. He looked at the vault door, then at me. He knew the police would be here within minutes. He spit on the ground but turned back toward his sedan. The power dynamic had snapped. I was no longer the victim. I was the one holding the leash. He backed his car away, clearing the exit. I didn't wait. I tore out of the garage, the tires screaming on the pavement. The drive back to the hospital was a blur of red lights and adrenaline. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting sirens or Marcus. Neither came. My phone buzzed with a notification from the hospital app. Emma was being moved to the pre-op suite. The surgeons were scrubbed and ready. I reached the hospital entrance and sprinted toward the elevators. The envelope was tucked tightly under my arm like a shield. The surgical floor was a hive of controlled activity. Nurses moved with purpose, their rubber soles squeaking on the tiles. I saw Emma through the glass door of the prep room. She looked tiny on the massive gurney. Her hair was tucked into a blue surgical cap. She saw me and tried to wave. Her hand was heavy with the IV line. I pressed my palm against the glass. I whispered a promise that she couldn't hear. The doors began to swing open. Dr. Aris met me in the hallway. He looked tired but focused. He didn't ask about the money again. He saw the envelope in my hand and nodded. He told me the procedure would take 6 hours. It was a long time to wait in the dark. I handed him the original receipt of the theft. He tucked it into his pocket without reading it. He told me to go get some water. I watched them wheel my daughter away toward the bright lights. I sat in the waiting room, the only person in the plastic chairs. The clock on the wall ticked with a mechanical finality. I pulled out my phone to check the news. The wedding scandal was trending locally. Pictures of the ruined ballroom were everywhere. My father's face was visible in one shot, slumped against a police car. He looked old and defeated. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. Then, a new message appeared from a number I didn't recognize at all. The text was brief and chilling. It said the feds had found the safe deposit box, but it was already empty. I looked down at the envelope I had taken. It only contained the receipt, not the cash. If the money was gone, the police would think I had stolen it during my visit. Marcus hadn't been trying to stop me from entering. He had been waiting for me to leave so I would take the blame. I was now the prime suspect in the theft. I stared at the screen, the blue light stinging my tired eyes. The empty vault box was a death trap designed by Marcus. He had played me perfectly, letting me enter the facility so the security cameras could record my face. Now, I was the one who looked like a fleeing thief. I looked at the surgical wing doors. My daughter was under the knife, and I couldn't leave. The police would be here soon. I had to prove the money was gone before I arrived. I needed to see the vault logs immediately. I stood up, my knees cracking from the tension. The waiting room was a desert of beige plastic and hushed whispers. I found a computer terminal near the nursing station used for guest check-ins. It wasn't secure, but I only needed a glimpse of the internal network. My fingers flew over the keys, fueled by a cold, sharp desperation. I looked for the remote access portal for the downtown vault. I just needed one timestamp to change the game. The hospital Wi-Fi was painfully slow. I watched a loading circle spin like a mocking eye. A security guard walked past, his radio chirping with static. I lowered my head, hiding my face behind the monitor. Finally, the login screen flickered to life. I used the credentials I had memorized from the manager's desk earlier. The system was ancient, vulnerable to the simplest of entries. I navigated to the activity log for box 402. My breath hitched in my throat when the data finally loaded. The logs showed the box had been accessed 2 hours before I arrived. The signature on the digital pad was a messy scrawl. It didn't belong to Marcus. It didn't belong to Julian. The name listed was Margaret, my mother. She hadn't just stolen the surgery fund from the bank. She had cleared out the secondary cash reserve before the wedding even started. She had planned her own escape while her sons were being led away in chains. My mother was the true ghost in the machine. I took a photo of the screen with my phone. This was the leverage I needed to clear my name. But as I turned to leave the station, I saw a familiar figure standing by the elevators. It was my father. He wasn't in custody. He looked disheveled, his expensive tuxedo jacket stained with something dark. He saw me and started walking forward. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. He didn't look like he wanted an apology. He looked like he wanted blood. He grabbed my arm before I could retreat. His grip was surprisingly strong, a desperate strength born of total ruin. He hissed that I had destroyed everything they built. He blamed me for the sirens and the shame. I shoved him back, pointing toward the doors, where Emma was fighting for her life. I told him the truth about the vault. I showed him the photo of my mother's signature. He stopped breathing for a second. The realization hit him harder than any physical blow I could deliver. He slumped against a trash can, the fight draining out of him. He whispered that she told him the cash was for the lawyers. He didn't know she had already used it to buy a ticket out of the country. I realized then that my father was just another pawn in her game. He was the distraction, the loud mouth used to cover her quiet movements. I felt a flicker of pity, but it died quickly. He had still laughed when the money was first gone. The elevator doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. They spotted my father and me immediately. They moved with a purpose that suggested they weren't here for a social visit. I stood my ground, holding the phone out like a white flag. I told them I had evidence of the primary theft. They didn't listen at first, reaching for their handcuffs. One officer looked at my father's stained jacket and asked if he was all right. My father just pointed at me and started to cry. The officers pulled me aside, their voices low and stern. They confirmed the vault was empty and that I was the last person on camera. I handed over the phone and explained the log entry. They looked at the photo, then at each other. One of them stepped away to make a call to the precinct. The other kept his hand on his holster, watching the surgical doors. Just then, a red light began to flash above the operating room. A code was being called for Emma. The red light pulsed like a dying star. I lunged toward the operating room doors, but the officer's hand clamped onto my shoulder. He told me to stay back. I yelled that my daughter was in there. The second officer was still scrolling through my phone, his face unreadable in the harsh light. Nurses scrambled past us, pushing a cart loaded with rattling canisters and monitors. The atmosphere in the hallway had shifted from sterile waiting to active crisis. I felt the world tilt on its axis. My father sat on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He was a broken shell of a man, crushed by the weight of my mother's final betrayal. The officer with my phone finally looked up and met my eyes. He told his partner to let me go. He said the timestamp on the photo cleared me of the vault theft. I didn't feel relief. I only felt the terror of the flashing red light. I ran to the glass observation window, my heart hammering. Through the glass, I saw Dr. Ayres bent over Emma's small, still form. The room was a blur of blue scrubs and silver instruments. A technician was adjusting a bypass machine that hummed with a low, mechanical drone. I pressed my forehead against the cool pane. I watched the line on the main monitor go flat for 3 eternal seconds. Then, a sharp beep echoed through the speaker system. Her heart was fighting back. The surgeons didn't stop. They moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. I stood there for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the sight of the open chest. The officer stepped up beside me, handing my phone back with a quiet apology. He said they had just issued an all-points bulletin for my mother. She had been spotted at the regional airport an hour ago. I didn't care about the money or the chase anymore. I just wanted the girl on the table to breathe on her own. The officer stayed with me, a silent shadow. A side door opened, and a nurse stepped out to grab a fresh unit of blood. I caught her sleeve and asked for a status update. She looked at my frantic eyes and softened her expression. She told me they had hit a snag with the valve seating, but the rhythm was stabilizing. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a chance. I thanked her, my voice cracking. She disappeared back into the theater. I turned to see my father standing behind me. He looked at the window, then at me. He whispered that he never meant for it to go this far. I told her that meaning didn't matter when my daughter was bleeding out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He said it was the one thing he managed to take from the wedding gift table before the raid. He handed it to me with trembling fingers. I opened it and saw a pair of diamond earrings. They were gaudy and cold. I stared at the jewelry, feeling a surge of pure disgust. He thought a handful of stones could replace the years of sacrifice and the stolen fund. I handed the box back to him and told him to leave. He started to protest, mentioning the family name and the upcoming trials. I told him he didn't have a family anymore. I watched him walk toward the elevators, his shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than the 7-year-old girl fighting for her life. The red light finally stopped flashing. The surgeons began to pull back from the table, their movements slowing down. Dr. Ayres looked up at the window and gave a single, wary nod. He pointed toward the recovery ward. I slumped against the wall, the adrenaline leaving my body in a cold rush. The officer patted my arm and said he had to go process the report. I was alone in the hallway again. The silence was finally a peaceful one. I walked toward the recovery area, passing the janitor mopping up the scuff marks from the raid. My phone buzzed with a notification from a news app. My mother had been detained at the boarding gate with $50,000 in cash in her carry-on. The headline called it a family fraud scandal. I swiped the notification away without reading the details. I entered Emma's room and sat by her bed. That was when I noticed the man sitting in the corner chair. The man in the corner was a federal agent named Thomas. He wore a rumpled gray suit and held a leather briefcase on his knees. I sat by Emma's bed, watching the rhythmic rise of her chest. The heart monitor beeped with a new, healthy stability that brought tears to my eyes. Thomas didn't offer a greeting or a smile. He simply watched the IV bag drip for a moment before speaking. He told me the investigation into my brother's business had expanded. They found my name on more documents than I originally thought. Thomas pulled a thick folder from his case and slid it onto the bedside table. He explained that my mother hadn't just used Emma's name for a vault. She had listed me as a silent partner in a series of fraudulent real estate holdings. My signature was perfectly forged on every page. This was her true contingency plan. If Julian fell, I was designed to be the secondary target for the prosecution. She had traded my freedom for her potential escape. I looked at the ink on the page and felt a cold, deep chill. The pressure in the room became stifling as the agent continued. He said the grand jury was meeting in 2 days. Unless I could prove these signatures were faked, the restitution funds for Emma's surgery would be frozen as suspected criminal proceeds. My stomach dropped into a hollow pit. I had saved my daughter's life, but I was about to lose my ability to stay with her. I needed an original document with my mother's real hand writing to prove the pattern of forgery. Everything I owned had been searched. I was out of time. I remembered the diamond earrings my father had tried to give me in the hallway. He said they were from the wedding gift table, but that was another lie. Those earrings belonged to a set my mother had inherited decades ago. She always kept the appraisal papers in a locked box beneath the floorboards of her sewing room. Those papers would have her genuine signature and her handwriting from years ago. If I could get that box, I could clear my name and protect Emma's money. The problem was the house was now a sealed crime scene. I left the hospital under the cover of a shifting guard change. The night air was thick with the scent of impending rain. I drove to my parents' neighborhood, parked 3 blocks away, and approached the house through the back alley. Yellow police tape fluttered against the white picket fence like a warning flag. The windows were dark, reflecting the streetlights. I felt like a thief in my own childhood home. I slipped through the unlocked basement window and dropped onto the cold concrete floor. The house smelled of stale lavender and old secrets. I moved silently through the kitchen and up toward the sewing room. Every floorboard seemed to groan under my weight. I reached the small closet and knelt on the carpet. My fingers searched for the loose plank behind the radiator. I found the notch and pried it upward with a pocket knife. The wooden box was still there, covered in a fine layer of dust. I pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside were the appraisal papers, just as I remembered. But there was something else. A handwritten letter addressed to me, dated 3 days ago. The letter was a confession, written in my mother's elegant, flowing script. She admitted to the forgeries. and the theft of the surgery fund. She wrote that she expected me to understand the necessity of protecting the family's future. It was a cold, transactional apology that lacked any real remorse. She had intended for me to find this only after she had safely crossed the border. I gripped the paper so hard it wrinkled. I had the proof I needed, but the cost was the final destruction of my childhood memories. I heard a floorboard creak. I froze, holding my breath as I listened to the stillness. Someone else was in the house. I tucked the box under my arm and moved toward the door. A shadow blocked the hallway. It was my brother, Julian. He wasn't in a jail cell. He looked haggard, his tuxedo shirt torn and his face bruised. He told me he had been released on a technicality and needed the box. He didn't know I had already opened it. He thought the cash was still inside. He stepped forward, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic rage. Julian didn't care about the letter or the forgeries. He only wanted the untraceable bills he thought were hidden in the false bottom. I told him our mother had already cleared the vault in the house. He didn't believe me, accusing me of being the greedy one. He lunged, trying to grab the box from my hands. We tumbled into the hallway, crashing against a small end table. A vase shattered, the sound echoing through the empty rooms like a gunshot. I shoved him back, my adrenaline masking the pain in my shoulder. He was losing control. I managed to scramble to my feet and head for the stairs. Julian was right behind me, shouting threats that didn't make sense anymore. I reached the front door and fumbled with the deadbolt. He tackled me from behind, his weight slamming me against the wood. We struggled on the porch, the rain finally beginning to fall in heavy, cold sheets. I managed to kick him away and sprint toward my car. I didn't look back until I was miles away. The letter was still gripped tightly in my hand. I had won again. I arrived back at the federal building just as the sun began to rise. Thomas was waiting in the lobby, looking like he hadn't slept at all. I handed him the box and the confession letter without saying a word. He read the pages slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to grim realization. He told me this would be enough to drop the charges against me. The restitution funds would remain untouched and secure. I leaned against the cold marble wall, my eyes closing. The war was finally over. I could go back to Emma. The agent walked me to the exit and said they had a lead on my mother's location. She hadn't left the country yet. She was hiding in a coastal town 2 hours away. He asked if I wanted to be there when they brought her in. I shook my head and told him I had a daughter to raise. I walked out into the crisp morning air, the light feeling new on my skin. I drove back to the hospital, the silence of the car no longer feeling like a burden. I was free of them. I walked into Emma's room and found her awake. She was sitting up, watching a cartoon with the volume turned low. She smiled when she saw me, a bright, genuine expression that reached her eyes. I sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. She asked if the bad people were gone now. I told her they were, and that we were going to be just fine. She drifted back to sleep, her hand still holding mine. Then, my phone buzzed with a photo of my mother in handcuffs. She wasn't alone. The photo on my screen showed my mother seated in the back of a squad car. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive silk blouse was stained with salt air. Standing next to the vehicle was Marcus, his head bowed in a posture of complete defeat. They had been hiding together in a rented beach shack. The betrayal went deeper than I imagined. They weren't just business associates. They were partners in a long-term plan to liquidate the family's assets. I lowered the phone, feeling the weight of their combined greed. Emma snored in her sleep, her small hand twitching against the sterile white sheets. The monitor pulsed with a steady, rhythmic green line that felt like a miracle. I had protected her life, but the legal ripples of the arrest were just beginning to reach the hospital. Thomas stepped back into the room, his face tight with fresh concern. He told me that the state planned to seize the house immediately. Everything inside was now considered evidence of the broader conspiracy. I thought of the small toy box in the corner of my old room. I asked Thomas that it could retrieve Emma's belongings before the locks were changed for good. He checked his watch and gave me a silent, reluctant nod. I had 1 hour before the federal marshals arrived to board up the windows. I drove back to the neighborhood, the morning sun casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. The street was crowded with neighbors whispering behind their hands. They watched me as if I were a stranger. I didn't look at them. I only saw the yellow tape. The front door was slightly ajar, the wood splintered from Julian's desperate entry earlier that night. Slept. I stepped inside the foyer and felt the crushing silence of a dead home. The air was cold, stripped of the warmth that usually lived in the kitchen. I moved upstairs to the nursery I had painted for Emma years ago. Her favorite stuffed rabbit sat on the rocking chair, waiting for a child who would never return to this house. I began to pack her things into a plastic bin. Every object felt heavy. As I reached for a box of books, I noticed a loose floorboard near the crib. It wasn't the one I had pried up in the sewing room. This was different. Hidden beneath a heavy rug, I moved the furniture and lifted the wood with a small crowbar I found. Tucked inside was a thick, black ledger bound in leather. It didn't belong to my mother or my brother. I opened the first page and saw my father's precise, architectural handwriting. He hadn't been a pawn. He was the bookkeeper. The ledger contained a decade of meticulously recorded transactions. My father had been tracking every cent my mother and Julian stole. He hadn't stopped them, but he had kept a receipt for every single betrayal. He had been building a case against his own family for years. I realized then why he had stayed so quiet during the dinners. He wasn't smoothing things over. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was just as cold as the rest of them. He had watched us suffer. I heard a heavy footstep on the stairs. I tucked the ledger into my jacket and stood up. My father appeared in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the hole in the floor. He didn't look broken anymore. He looked sharp and dangerous. He asked me to hand over the book, his voice low and steady. He told me that ledger was his only leverage for a plea deal. I backed away toward the window, the plastic bin of toys acting as a shield. He stepped closer. The silence between us was filled with the sound of a distant siren. I told him you should have used the evidence to save Emma years ago. He claimed Cladian's waiting until the amount was high enough to ensure life sentences for everyone. He had traded his granddaughter's health for a guaranteed victory in court. I felt a surge of pure, blinding hatred. He reached for my jacket, his fingers brushing against the leather binding. I shoved him hard against the wall. He stumbled, gasping for breath. I jumped through the open window onto the porch roof. I scrambled down the trellis and ran toward my car, the bin of toys rattling in my arms. He shouted from the bedroom window, but he didn't follow me. He knew the marshals were only minutes away. I threw the bin into the back seat and tore away from the curb. The ledger was a bomb in my lap. If I gave it to Thomas, my father would go down with everyone else. He deserved the cell. I pulled into the hospital parking lot, and sat in the dark for a long time. The ledger was the final piece of the puzzle. It proved that my father had willfully allowed the theft of the surgery fund to happen. He had watched the account hit zero and said nothing because it served his long-term legal strategy. He was the most calculated monster of them all. I walked into the lobby and saw Thomas waiting by the security desk. He looked at me expectantly. I handed him the black ledger without saying a word. He opened it, and I watched his eyes widen as he processed the sheer volume of the data. He told me this would change the entire scope of the prosecution. My father would not be getting a plea deal. He would be the center of the trial. Thomas thanked me and said he would handle the rest. I turned away, feeling a strange sense of finality. The entire family tree was finally being cut down to the roots. I went back up to the surgical recovery wing. Emma was awake now, sipping water through a colorful plastic straw. She asked me if we were going home soon. I told her we were going to find a new home, somewhere far away from the shadows. I felt the weight of the last few days finally begin to lift. We had no money from the family, but we had the restitution and her health. That was more than enough to start a new life. I smiled at her. The sun was high in the sky now, shining through the large hospital windows. I watched the city move below us, unaware of the quiet war that had just ended. My phone buzzed one last time with a message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. I hope it was worth it. I didn't reply. I deleted the message and turned the phone off. I leaned back in the chair and watched my daughter breathe. For the first time, the air felt clean. The hospital room felt still as the morning light hit the linoleum floor. Emma was asleep again, her tiny hand curled around a plastic toy. I realized my objective had shifted from survival to total erasure. I needed to move us before the family lawyers started their desperate counter-attacks. My phone sat dead on the tray table, a black mirror of my past. I watched the heart monitor's steady pulse. The mechanical rhythm was the only truth left in my world. We were finally safe. I began packing Emma's recovery bag with mechanical precision. I tucked her slippers beside the discharge papers. A nurse entered with a final set of vitals and a soft smile. She mentioned that a man was waiting in the lobby to see me. My heart skipped a beat, thinking of Julian or my father's reach. I checked the hallway, my muscles tensing for a fight. The nurse handed me a small envelope. It was thick and heavy. I opened it slowly. Inside was a cashier's check for the full stolen amount. There was no note, only a stamp from the Federal Restitution Office. Thomas had moved faster than the legal system usually allowed. The money was back, but it felt different now. It was no longer a symbol of my sacrifice. It was a trophy of a war that had cost me my entire history. I looked at Emma's peaceful face. The price was high, but the result was breathing right here. I walked to the window and looked down at the street below. A white sedan was parked near the entrance, its engine idling. I saw a woman step out, her face obscured by a wide hat. It wasn't my mother or the bride. It was a face I didn't recognize, someone watching the wing with intent. I realized the family's reach extended beyond blood. They had creditors and partners who were still looking for the missing cash. The danger hadn't ended with the arrests. I called Thomas using the hospital bedside phone. I told him about the car and the check in my hand. He sounded tired but alert. He explained that Julian's partners were looking for the ledger I had turned in. My father had promised them it was destroyed. Now that the truth was out, they were hunting the source. I had to leave through the service tunnels. The hospital security team was already moving into position. This wasn't a discharge. This was an extraction. We moved through the basement, the air smelling of industrial soap. Emma was awake now, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket over her legs. She held her rabbit tightly. As we passed the humming generators, the security guard led us to a nondescript van, waiting at the loading dock. I saw the white sedan circle the block once more. They were waiting for the main exit. I felt a cold, sharp resolve. I would never let them touch her again. Slept. The van pulled away, weaving through the morning traffic with practiced ease. I looked back at the hospital tower, until it disappeared behind the skyline. Emma asked where we were going. I told her we were going to the coast, where the air was salty and clean. She nodded, her eyes heavy with the last of the medication. I checked the ledger one last time, before dropping it into a shredding bin at the safe house. The past was officially gone. We arrived at a small cottage by the sea 3 hours later. The sound of the waves replaced the beep of the monitors. I sat on the porch and watched Emma walk slowly across the sand. Her heart was strong, and her future was hers again. I finally let the check slip into my pocket. I had lost a family, but I had gained a daughter. I smiled as the sun touched the water. Then, my new phone buzzed once.